The Light of Amsterdam opens in Belfast on the day of George Best's funeral, when the whole city became awake. And it tells the story of three couples: a mother going on her daughter's hen party, a father lumbered with his 16-year-old son, and a husband and wife all heading for Amsterdam for a weekend just before Christmas. The part of the book I'm going to read is from the end of the first chapter, and it describes one of the central characters, Alan, who's recently divorced, has been summoned by his ex-wife to the family home to desperately try and communicate with their 16-year-old son, who has entered the dark waters of teenage angst. It hasn't been a very wonderful day. But on this funeral day, as he drove slowly and reluctantly back to his flat, he sensed only the infinite complexity of what stretched ahead of him. He thought about the soup, knew how much he wanted to stay, even in a house where he wasn't fully loved. He thought of stolen blessings and the mess of pottage that awaited him, and irrespective of what he had brought on himself, couldn't help but feel cheated out of things that were rightfully his. He drove past council workers removing barriers and traffic cones, their yellow jackets luminous against the day's shadows. Wind-blown flower petals frittered up like confetti. George was starting out on his journey by now. He felt shut out too by his own son. If he would let him be his father, there were so many important things that he could tell him, things that might help him face full on the relentless storm of life. As he drove, he talked to his son, told him that nothing was simple, except to the stupid and the dangerous. So Jack, don't be frightened of uncertainty and confusion. It's our natural state. And as he headed along the embankment beside the dark skin of the river, suddenly there was a single rower, sculling the water, his oars twisting little curlicues of white. He pulled the car over to the pavement, got out, and stood watching as the oarsman slowly disappeared into the dusk. He was taking George home. After all the public pomp and show of ceremony, the eulogies and the flowers, he was taking George home. If he were religious, he would have said a prayer for safe crossing, a prayer for all their coming journeys. But instead, he simply bowed his head for a moment, then watched as the silent wake slowly disappeared and the street lamps began to sheen and smear the dark surface of the water into some new tremble of light.
It's a beautifully written novel, David. I don't mean to be condescending when I say that, but it's all the richer for hearing your voice. It's also, in narrative terms, quite a complicated novel. I wonder if you could possibly just describe its outline, blurb it a bit for the prospective reader.
I basically try to internalise the life of the three central characters. They're quite contrasting characters and they face quite different predicaments in their personal lives, and they've all come to Amsterdam for different reasons. So I'm really trying to capture the inner life of each of these three central characters. Alan, going to see his great hero Bob Dylan in concert, but lumbered with this 16-year-old son of his who doesn't want to be in Amsterdam. Karen, who is reluctantly tagging on to her daughter's hen party, and Marion, middle-aged, insecure, nervous, who's come with her husband and is afflicted by her own doubts. And I try to interweave those three internalizations.
It's a very accidental connection between them, though, isn't it? I mean, is that how you see life?
Yes, I would say so. I think also because the book was largely written while I was working as a teacher, it always helped me to write in achievable sections. So the idea of just writing a novel with a vague, endless horizon was very daunting. So I liked the idea of writing this section and then just adding on the next section and then adding on the third section.
This is a question which I fear you'll have been expecting, because in fact all the reviewers have brought it up. It's been very well received, your novel, quite properly. But they do say you've rather shifted your ground.
I have. You should never think about what posterity is going to say about you, but as I get older, I have this nagging little voice in the back of my head that I don't want to be labelled the writer of the Troubles. And basically, I got my instructions from my wife, who told me to lighten up, and it was time I wrote a book about love, and this is my attempt to write a book about love.
There's a certain kind of sort of depressive climate in the book, though, isn't there? I mean, it's almost like it's almost like an escape from something which is behind all these characters.
True love never runs smoothly, and this is the closest I think I'm ever going to get to writing a book that is even vaguely happy. So love is complex, love can be painful, love can be demanding, especially, and I think it's one of the book's central themes, the love of a parent for a child. And I think anyone who's ever had an adolescent will know that sometimes love can be stretched very, very tight.
Jack, in fact, is one of the more interesting. This is the son, the son who's gone goth, in fact.
Yes.
I mean,
Jack has done what all normal teenagers do. He's gone into this tunnel of teenage darkness. Thankfully, teenagers go in and come out. But that period when they're inside that self-absorption, that monosyllabic, closed down world, which feels as if it's linked primarily to a computer as opposed to a parent. It's a difficult and painful rite of passage for the parent. You know, all the old simplicities are gone. And I wanted to bring out the father's love for Jack. And what the father is ultimately struggling to do is to find a way of expressing that love that won't suffocate his child, that won't embarrass his child, won't be irrelevant to his child. And it's very, very challenging how you find a way to give your love to a child sometimes.
I think it's fair to say that the quality of your writing is poetic. Beautifully so. Does that, in fact, get in the way of actually being kind of emotionally honest sometimes? You know, when in fact you sort of, as I said, you've got to strip away the poetry and actually get to the heart of the matter.
It's a difficult question. Although the book is very different in its subject matter to previous work, I think really the style is probably reasonably similar. I started off in life trying to write poetry, and there's some legacy of that lingers on, for good or bad, I'm not quite sure.
People tend to place you in the tradition of Brianne Moore, don't they? Which I don't know whether you accept that as a legacy.
I could only say in a genuinely humble way. I mean, that's a very strong compliment, and I personally wouldn't ever make that claim about myself.
But of course he left, didn't he?
He did. I heard him read not a huge amount of time before he died, and bizarrely he said it was one of the few times he'd ever been asked to read in Belfast, and the venue was absolutely packed to the gills.
Did he have an American accent? I spoke to him a couple of times on the West Coast, and he seemed to have a sort of kind of compromised way of speaking.
I think probably so. And you know, some people might or might not think the name from Brian to Brian was an affectation. I don't know, but what does it really matter at the end of the day? He wrote beautiful books.
You voice your books very carefully, don't you?
I try to. I mean, the key to writing the inner self is capturing the voice, and the key also is to be able to see the world through the eyes of that person, to empathetically become that person, so that you're not remote, you're not a judge, you're not standing in judgment on them, but you're seeing the world through their eyes, for better or worse.
Your publishers have given you a very beautiful cover, but they've actually decided that the subject of the book is Amsterdam. Now, I get to ask you an obvious question, why Amsterdam? But I don't remember in Irvin Welsh in his novel, actually, sort of, the hero at the end is going to Amsterdam with a one-way ticket. Why did you choose that place?
I first went to Amsterdam when I was 19. The Troubles had basically just started. I went in the summer to Amsterdam. It was my first stay in a European city, and I was just completely amazed by the city. The beauty of the architecture, the painting, the number of young people. It just seemed the most wonderful place. And I could hear this voice in my head saying, everybody who lives in Northern Ireland, it should be compulsory. They go and live in Amsterdam for 6 months, and the politicians for at least a year.
But in the novel, it's much more temporary, isn't it? It's a kind of day past, practically.
It is. It's a bit of a cliche, but I think it's true that sometimes when we leave our normal environment and journey somewhere far, it allows us to see our own lives more clearly, in sharper focus. And I like the idea of being in Amsterdam and having the city be disorientating, be surprising, and also be powerful, and how that would impact and affect the emotions and the thinking of the central characters.
You start very powerfully with George Best in the novel and finish with Bob Dylan. What does he mean to you?
When I was about 16, my parents bought me a little red mono record player. I think in later years they came to think of it as the Trojan horse. But I didn't have a record, so I went into Belfast and I bought my first LP. And I didn't know a huge amount about Bob Dylan, but I bought Bob Dylan's greatest hits. And when I played one particular track, which was Like a Rolling Stone, and those opening, freewheeling, cascading chords, my whole world just turned on its axis. Nothing ever seemed quite the same again. It just freed a whole range of different possibilities that I hadn't realised even existed in life.
It's a kind of quest for Dylan in a sense, isn't it? I mean, you could actually see it that way.
But it's also connected with that inevitability too of your heroes disappointing you. Yeah. And the experience of Dylan in concert for Alan is ultimately a disappointing one. He's come 15 years too late.
I do feel sorry for Alan in a way. I mean, is there any kind of happiness sort of that you foresee for him over the edge of the novel?
I think that his love for his child will ultimately bear fruit, and that his child will return to him. Though sometimes readers ask you about the characters, what happens to them after the end of the novel, and the simple truth is I have no idea, and that is for the reader to imagine and create. I don't know. There
are two other centres to this book, both of which are sort of focused on women's experience. Yes. Was that difficult for you, as it were, to cross the gender line?
I don't think so, and I mean, it's an terrible generalisation to say, but I suspect that the emotional inner life of women is more interesting than that of men, simply because women allow themselves access to a wider range of emotions. It's not that they have a wider range of emotions, but they permit themselves access, I think, to a wider range of emotions. And I find women, as a writer, infinitely interesting, complex, subtle.
And they too, in fact, have little crises in their lives, don't they?
The first middle-aged woman, Marion, is terribly insecure about her appearance, about her handsome husband's potential for infidelity.
And the gym membership.
And he's bought her a gym membership, which is a two-edged sword for any woman to get that as a present, I think. And the image I like about the gym is she goes to the gym for the first time and she sees this beautiful young woman who's beautifully toned on a running machine, and it's as if she's running to the image that she sees of herself in the glass, the perfect image that she sees, and Marion knows she will never reach that image. So the book plays out on her insecurities and trying to come to terms with those. And the other female character is Karen, who works every hour God sends as a cleaner and in a care home, but is one of those people in life who has not perhaps had all the opportunities that her character deserves, and she struggles. She struggles to pay for her wayward daughter's every whim and all the accoutrements and desires that she has for the wedding.
What is the light in Amsterdam? Is it kind of
I think that because I grew up in that evangelical background, I mean, I don't have that evangelical faith, but there are images that stay with me. And one of those powerful images would be of Transfiguration, or transcendence as well. So what I wanted to do ultimately in this book is take 3 seemingly mundane, quiet lives, take them to this new place and have them transfigured, both by the power of the city, but also by the power of their insights into their own lives and their own dreams and their hopes for their own futures.
David, fiction uncovered is a rather novel kind of novel prize in the sense that it has a kind of, as it were, 8 winners.
It's wonderful, and I'm delighted to be on this list, and it takes that awful cutthroat competitive element out of the event, and I'm happy to share equal billing with the other 7 writers, and it's just lovely to have the book receive some attention, so I'm very, very pleased.
The magnificent 8, we think of them as. Thank you.